All right, everybody, get ready for another deep dive. This time, we're headed straight into 18th century Limburg. Picture this. A time when whispers of this gang, they called them the Buckriders, filled the night. We're talking real-life crime sprees, but with this twist of, spooky legends, superstitions running wild, theft, torture, even accusations of making deals with the devil himself. We're going to unpack it all. And the best part is we've got a ton of sources to dig through. Historical accounts, folklore, there's even a theme park tie-in. Ready to dive in and separate fact from fiction. I'm joined by our expert who's going to help us make sense of it all. So, first things first, what was life actually like back in 18th century Limburg?
Well, imagine a region, right, stuck between what we now call the Netherlands and Belgium. Life in 18th century Limburg, especially out on those farmlands, it was rough. Poverty was everywhere, just a constant shadow over everything. And there was this underlying feeling of, social unrest, like something was going to boil over. And those remote farmsteads, they were pretty much easy pickings for anyone who wanted to take advantage.
So, kind of ripe for the taking, if you were that kind of person. And then on top of all that, you've got this widespread belief in the supernatural. It wasn't just the day-to-day struggles. There was this whole other level of fear, right? About witches, demons.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just like a passing fad. This belief that the supernatural was woven into everyday life, it was deeply rooted. It's what made it possible for legends like the Buckriders to take hold and spread like wildfire. Just picture it, you're a farmer just trying to get by and you hear these stories about these figures riding flying goats in the dead of night, making deals with the devil for power, enough to make anyone double bolt their doors right.
Okay, so we've got poverty, unrest, and a whole lot of superstition brewing, and then enter the Buckriders. From what I've read, these weren't your run-of-the-mill thieves. What made them so terrifying?
You see, that's just it. They were more than just thieves. They had this aura about them, this supernatural dread that clung to them. Imagine those whispers, right? These figures cloaked in darkness, appearing out of nowhere on the backs of flying goats. It's like something out of a nightmare, and that's exactly what they used to their advantage.
Even the name itself, Buckriders, goat riders, it's creepy. But they weren't just about scary appearances, right? There are stories about them making pacts with the devil himself, trading their souls for supernatural abilities. So what kind of crimes were they said to have committed?
They were infamous for terrorizing the countryside, robbing churches, breaking into homes, ransacking farms. No one was safe. But the real stroke of genius, or maybe I should say deviousness, was how they used the existing folklore to their advantage.
So they tapped into the fear that was already simmering just below the surface.
Exactly. They weren't content with just stealing. They wanted to instill terror. Imagine you're a farmer right there in 18th century Limburg. You hear a noise in the night, and suddenly your entire barn is up in flames. Was it an accident? Or did the Buckriders leave behind a calling card, like a goat hoof print in the dirt, just to mess with you?
Weaponizing folklore, turning rumors and legends into a tool of intimidation. And you have to think, in a time when people really believed in this stuff, the terror they inflicted was magnified tenfold.
Oh, absolutely. The psychological impact was huge. They knew that fear was a powerful weapon, maybe even more effective than any physical force.
And even though we know better now, there's still a part of us that wonders, was there any truth to the supernatural stuff? Did any of these Buckriders actually believe they'd made deals with the devil? Or was it all a big act?
It's a question that still fascinates historians. Were there true believers in their ranks? Or were they all opportunists, just using the legend for their own gain?
That's what makes this whole thing so interesting. We're talking at a time when the line between myth and reality was incredibly blurry, and the Buckriders, they seem to straddle that line perfectly. They become almost mythical themselves, these shadowy figures blurring the lines between man and monster.
And as we dig deeper into their story, we're going to uncover court records, historical accounts that paint a pretty grim picture of how those accusations played out.
Because for all the talk of flying goats and deals with the devil, these were real crimes with real victims, and they led to very real trials, right?
Sadly, yes. What began as whispers and rumors told around flickering candles, it ended up in courtrooms. And that's where the story takes a much darker turn.
Okay, then buckle up, everyone, because it sounds like we're about to step into a courtroom drama. A courtroom where superstition and fear, they weren't just present, they were practically running the show. So we're talking about a society gripped by fear, totally primed to believe that the devil's lurking around every corner, and then those whispers, those rumors, they escalate into full-blown accusations. And that leads to trials. What were those trials like?
All right, picture this. It's 18th century Limburg. And you're accused of being a Buckrider. Maybe a neighbor's got it out for you, or maybe you just fit someone's idea of what a devil worshiper looks like.
Yeah.
Point is, you're caught in this web of fear, this terrifying legend. And the legal system, let's just say it wasn't exactly known for fair trials.
Sounds like accusations held a lot of weight back then. Like
Right.
fear and superstition trumped any kind of reason or due process.
Exactly. And get this, one of the most disturbing things about these trials was something called the godless oath.
The godless oath. Okay, now that sounds intense. What was it all about?
Imagine being forced to swear an oath right there in court, renouncing God and pledging your allegiance to the devil. That was the godless oath. Refusing. That was
Yeah.
basically admitting you were guilty, a one-way ticket to the gallows.
Oh man, that kind of pressure, that fear, it's unimaginable. Especially in a society where belief in the devil was so real, so powerful.
And that's the truly chilling part. So many people, desperate to save themselves, they confess these horrible things they didn't do. We're talking torture. Straight up. Used to extract confessions, pushing people to the brink until they'd say anything to make it stop.
It's just heartbreaking, you know? These weren't all hardened criminals. We're talking about everyday people caught in this wave of mass hysteria, forced to make an impossible choice. Any idea how many people were accused, how many lives were destroyed because of this?
The numbers are staggering. Over several decades, we're talking over 1,200 people accused of being Buckriders. And out of those, almost 500 were executed.
Wow, nearly half of those accused. Those numbers really paint a dark picture. Are there any specific cases, any stories that stand out as particularly tragic or that really give you a sense of what it was like back then?
There's one that comes to mind, not just for how brutal it was, but also because it shows how accusations of witchcraft and Buckrider activity could get all tangled up. The case of the Aretz family.
Okay, the Aretz family, what happened to them?
It wasn't just theft. They were accused of infanticide, too. Michael Aretz, the father, he accused his own wife and stepson of murdering his daughter. Claimed they did it because she was pregnant.
He threw his own family under the bus to cover up a pregnancy. That's a whole new level of messed up.
It just shows you how fear, suspicion, even opportunism could poison family ties. And it didn't end well for them. They were executed in Scheisberg, near the Galgenbaumke, the place of the gallows.
This wasn't just about robberies and trials. This was about a legend fueled by fear and societal anxieties, tearing families and communities apart. But with all this going on, did anyone speak out against it? Were there any voices of reason during those times?
Well, as more and more people were executed, some started to question the trials. One of those people was Attorney General Gaspard de Limpens. In 1774, he publicly expressed his doubts about the whole Buckriders thing.
It's kind of wild to think about someone in a position of power questioning the very system they were a part of. How did he express his skepticism?
He went on record questioning those confessions, pointing at the whole torture thing and how that climate of fear pretty much invalidated them. He argued that many of those accused, maybe even most, were innocent, their confessions forced out of them under duress.
That's a bold stance to take, especially back then. It takes guts to challenge a system so entrenched in fear and superstition.
He was a voice of reason in a time when reason was in short supply. But what he said is so important. Fear and superstition can completely warp justice, and that leads to unimaginable cruelty and consequences that last for generations.
His story reminds us that even in the darkest times, there are always people who are brave enough to question things, to challenge the accepted story. But even with those voices of dissent, the legend of the Buckriders, it didn't just disappear, did it?
It did not. And that's what's so fascinating. Even as those trials faded into history, the legend took on a life of its own. It changed and evolved over time.
So how did this terrifying story, rooted in such a dark period, manage to capture people's imaginations, not just back then, but even centuries later? What kept the legend alive?
We see the Buckriders got a bit of a makeover, and we can thank something called the Romantic movement for that.
The Romantic movement? Hold on. What do poets and artists have to do with a band of, well, let's be real, ruthless criminals? I gotta hear. So the Romantic movement comes along, and all of a sudden, these guys, who were basically the stuff of nightmares, they get a PR boost. How did that happen?
Well, think about the themes that were big during the Romantic period.
Yeah.
Folklore, the macabre, even this idea of the noble outlaw. The guy who lives by his own rules, fights the system. And the Buckriders, in a weird way, they kind of fit that mold.
So they went from agents of chaos to, like, folk heroes.
Pretty much. the lines get blurry. In the hands of romantic artists and writers, they become these almost like brooding figures operating outside the law, thumbing their noses at authority. Kind of like how we romanticize pirates, right?
Okay, I see it. Everyone loves a good anti-hero story, but still, it's a big leap from robbing farmsteads to inspiring poems and paintings. What are some concrete ways this shift played out?
Well, there's this annual festival in Valkenburg, the Buckenweekend. It's basically goat markets celebrating the whole Buckriders thing. And then you've got monuments and statues dedicated to them all over the place.
Wow, so they're practically local celebrities centuries later. And speaking of celebrating the legend, we can't forget about that theme park connection we mentioned. That's next level, right?
For sure. At Efteling, there's a ride called Villa Volta. It's a haunted house attraction, but with a Buckriders twist.
Ooh, I love a good haunted house. Tell me more.
Okay, so the story revolves around this guy, Hugo van de Lunche Dynen. He's supposed to be a Buckrider who was cursed for robbing a church. The whole ride is themed around his story, with spooky music and special effects and everything.
So they took all the elements, haunted houses, flying goats, deals with the devil, and made it into a thrill ride. Classic. It just goes to show some stories never die, especially when you mix history, horror, and a little bit of the absurd.
And that's what makes the Buckriders so fascinating. Their story makes us confront not just the dark side of history, but also how we shape our own understanding of the past. We're drawn to myths and mysteries.
It makes you wonder what other historical figures, other events that we think we know, might look different if we really dug deep, if we looked past the legends and the romanticized stories.
Exactly. What stories are we telling and why? What biases do we bring to the table? The Buckriders remind us that history is fluid, always being reinterpreted, questioned, rewritten even. And that's exciting.
Totally agree. It means there's always more to uncover, more to learn, even in those stories we think we've got all figured out. For anyone listening who's ready to do some digging, there are some great resources out there. Buckriders, Bestande van Limburg by Francois van Koegten is a fantastic place to start. Or if you're more into the folklore side of things, Dutch folklore, The Buckriders is a really interesting read.
Those are just a couple of jumping off points. There are tons of books, articles, even local legends just waiting to be discovered.
Who knows? Maybe one of you listening will be the one to finally uncover the truth behind the Buckriders, or at least find a new thread to pull in this centuries-old mystery.
Because as we've seen today, sometimes the best stories are the ones that blur the lines between fact and fiction, the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep those minds open.